David glanced around the dimly lit waiting room. A handful of magazines, mostly catering to women, were strewn across the nightstand beside his chair. From a speaker perched on a shelf above his head, classical music played softly. The volume was just enough to mask the faint murmurs of conversation seeping through the walls, yet not so loud as to feel intrusive. The door creaked open, and she entered. Susan lifted her gaze to him, offering a weak smile. As his eyes briefly met hers, he quickly averted them. He made no attempt to speak. Despite the presence of 6 chairs in the room, she chose the one directly next to him. "Thank you for coming, David. I really hope Dr. Marx can help us move forward," she said softly. David remained silent, his eyes locking onto hers for a brief moment. In that glance, she caught a glimpse of the distrust etched in his gaze. Just as she prepared to offer yet another apology, the inner door swung open. A crying woman emerged, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Without pausing, the woman hurried across the room and exited the office. Moments later, a short, plump woman appeared in the doorway. Her hair was cropped short, and her face was nearly devoid of makeup. Her snug brown sweater emphasized her sagging chest, while her green skirt fell to mid-thigh. Simple brown shoes, flat and unassuming, only accentuated her petite stature. "Mr. and Mrs. Stillwell, I'm Fran Marx. Thank you for coming in today. Please, step into my office." Dr. Marx didn't wait for a reply. She turned and made her way back to her office, with Susan trailing closely behind. Reluctantly, David followed his wife inside. Once they were all seated, Dr. Marx began. "So, as I understand it, the court has mandated counseling at the request of Susan's attorney after David filed for divorce. Is that correct?" Both David and Susan nodded. Breaking the silence, Susan spoke first. "I'm hoping you can convince David to drop the divorce and come back home to me and the kids." Dr. Marx acknowledged her statement with a nod before turning her attention to David. "And you, David? Why are you here today?" David lifted his weary eyes to meet hers. "Because the judge ordered me to be here." "I see," Dr. Marx responded. "Well, we have 11 more sessions. Hopefully, we can address some of these issues and help you move forward with your lives." David remained silent, his vacant stare fixed on the doctor. With a quiet sigh, Fran leaned forward and addressed Susan. "All right, Susan, why don't you start by explaining why you're here?" "As I said, I want David to stop this ridiculous divorce and come back home." "I don't want a divorce. His parents, my parents, our children, and even our friends all agree that he should drop this nonsense and come back." "David, it sounds like everyone in your life believes you shouldn't go through with the divorce. What led you to file in the first place?" "She told me she didn't love me anymore." "I can't stay married to someone who doesn't love me," David replied flatly. Susan hissed in frustration. "That's not true. I never said I didn't love you. I've told you over and over that I do." "David, if Susan insists she still loves you, why don't you believe her?" Dr. Marx asked. David cast a disgusted look at Susan before turning back to the doctor. "Actions speak louder than words." "Actions? But I didn't do anything," Susan protested, her voice rising. David folded his arms and said nothing. Dr. Marx arched an eyebrow. "You'll need to explain what you mean, David." David raised his wrist and glanced at his Apple Watch. After a few taps, he finally spoke. 5 weeks ago this Friday, I came home from work. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, waiting for me. It took me less than a minute to sense something was off. She asked me to sit down because we needed to talk. After handing me the glass, she told me she'd accepted a date with another man and planned to go out with him the next evening. She said if things went well, she wouldn't be back until Sunday afternoon. "Dr. Marx," David began, his tone firm, "I may not be the brightest tool in the shed, but even I could see what this meant. When my wife planned to spend the night with another man, it was clear she no longer loved me. Susan groaned, exasperated. But I didn't do anything. I didn't go on the date, I didn't sleep with anyone. You left me and filed for divorce, even though I never did anything wrong. Is that true, David? Dr. Marx asked, her expression perplexed. Susan says she neither went on the date nor cheated on you. If that's the case, why did you file for divorce? Intent, David replied without hesitation. Dr. Marx frowned, her confusion deepening. Intent? David nodded again. Yes. Her intent. She planned to see the other man and expected me to approve of it. After I left, she said she cancelled the date and spent the entire weekend trying to find me. Do you have any reason to believe that isn't true? Dr. Marx inquired. Not really, David admitted, but it doesn't matter. Her intentions were clear, she intended to sleep with another man, which means I wasn't enough for her anymore. I never said that. Susan screamed. You didn't need to say it, David countered sharply. Your intentions screamed it loud and clear, humiliating me in the process. Dr. Marx raised her hands in an effort to regain control of the conversation. David, I understand why you were upset by what Susan suggested. But the fact remains, she didn't follow through. When she realized you disapproved, she cancelled the date. Surely that deserves some credit. David shook his head, unconvinced. That's like saying I deserve credit for not robbing the bank next door. He paused briefly before continuing, noticing Dr. Marx's lingering confusion. If I planned a robbery, picked a getaway car, bought a mask, wrote a note for the teller, and handed it to her, that shows my intent to rob the bank. Now, if the teller read the note and said no, and I ran away, I'd still be guilty of attempted bank robbery. Dr. Marx leaned back in her chair, her gaze shifting between Susan and David. Slowly, she shook her head. I've been doing this for 17 years and have heard similar arguments countless times. Until today, I always defended a spouse who reconsidered and stayed true to their marriage. But I'm struggling to find flaws in your reasoning, David. I'm no lawyer, but I do know that intent to rob a bank is a felony, even if you don't actually take the money. David nodded, satisfied that Dr. Marx now understood his perspective. What's happening here? Susan asked, her voice laced with worry. What does robbing a bank have to do with any of this? Fran raised her hand to stop David. Please, explain it to her, she said. David turned to Susan, his tone firm but calm. Susan, you took the time to get to know this new man. Maybe you had lunch with him a few times or more. You developed an interest in him, a sexual interest, which led you to agree to a date. When you agreed, you knew full well what his intentions were. You were so certain of those intentions that you felt it necessary to inform me about your date and that it might require you to stay overnight. In doing so, you confirmed your own intentions to go along with his plans. In other words, you made it clear you intended to sleep with him. Canceling the date after I objected doesn't erase your initial intent. David's voice softened slightly, but the weight of his words remained. If you truly loved me the way I love you, you never would have agreed to go on a date with another man in the first place. The fact that you did means you can't love me the way I love you. I'm sorry, Susan, but I can't stay married to someone who doesn't love me enough to avoid men with those kinds of intentions. Susan lowered her head and began to sob quietly. Dr. Marx stood as David rose from his seat. Extending her hand, she said, "Thank you for coming today, David. I'll let the judge know there's no need for additional sessions for you." She turned to Susan. "However, I believe I'll spend more time working with you.